What up, Internet? I am the PCGoblin. And in today's video, we're finally going to be taking a look at the MAG Coreliquid, and we're going to be comparing it against the Kraken and the EK AIO just to see how this fits along with the other ones. And just as a baseline, because I think custom loops are as good as you can possibly get, we're going to be using the custom loop that's sitting on my wet bench right here. And the processor we're going to be cooling is an AMD Ryzen 3700X. So that should be good. And I will not be using the Vespula as my mousepad of choice. But that's enough talking. Let's go ahead and get to the testing already. So to start our testing, we're going to be using RealBench, and we're only going to be using the H.264 section of it because I've seen that get CPUs hotter than anything else. And then we're going to be using Prime 95 again to see how hot that gets the CPU with all the different coolers and whatnot. So I'm going to run each test for about 30 minutes, and then we can see what the temperature is after and see just how hot it got with each cooler. So I've already got RealBench started, and we'll come back and as soon as that's done and see just how hot the CPU is running. So this has been running for well over 30 minutes, so the loop is saturated and whatnot, and it's averaging at about 65C with a low of 33C, but whatever, it doesn't mean much, with a max of 76C. So at some point it hit 76, but it's averaging at 64, 65, so that's good. Time to switch tests. So we're going to go ahead and do torture test, hit OK, and then we're going to let this run for about 30 minutes and see what it gives us. It's now been 30 minutes, and we're seeing 65C on the average with a high of 81. When I came over here at about 30 minutes, this was actually up at 81C, so it definitely gets really, really hot with Prime 95. So I think we've got some pretty good samples. Now that we've got the baseline with the custom loop done, we're going to install the MSI Coreliquid and see what we get with that. We now have it installed like you just saw me do, and I put the fans on the back of it, or the front of it, I don't know how you want to say it, but I've got the fans pulling air through it and blowing it out the back, and the reason for that is I wanted to make sure that the fans were somewhat protected while it's sitting out here on my open bench. If it was in my case, I'd probably do push rather than pull, but overall, from every testing I've ever seen, push or pull, it doesn't really make much of a difference. But as you can see, the RGB is going all perfectly on it. And these are ARGB type fans, so your motherboard or whatever you're going to be plugging it in to control your RGB or your colors or whatever needs to be ARGB. That's the 3-pin, not the 4-pin. And as far as I know, there's no adapters, so if you don't have that in some factor, you're not going to be able to use it as far as I know. But I do have to say that this kind of pump is one of my favorite kind of pumps. And the reason being is none of this is reliant on the OS. It's all done through the BIOS on your motherboard. The ARGB for the pump head and whatnot is controlled through the motherboard, so it completely syncs up with the motherboard and everything looks nice and tidy. But then on top of that, the fans plug into this as well, and the motherboard controls the fans based on however you have it set up. So you can do it off your motherboard or off your CPU. Other motherboards may have other options, but this motherboard and all the motherboards I've ever seen, it's either CPU or motherboard temperature. So it's really nice. Don't have to worry about Windows at all for this to work properly. Now, some of you may not like it, but I do, I really do. But now that we've got it installed, let's start the testing. to kick things off, we're going to go ahead and open up hardware monitor, and just to make sure we've got 100% load, I'm going to bring up NZXT Cam. We're going to let it run for about an hour so that it has time to heat up and fully saturate the cooling loop, so we can get an idea of how good it's going to perform once it's all heated up and it's had a while to warm up and whatnot. So we'll be right back after about an hour. It's been well over an hour and we're seeing about an idle of 66C, and at some point it got up to 76C. So time to close this. Close hardware monitor. And now we'll start the testing with Prime 95 and reopen hardware monitor to see what we get out of that. Okay, and we'll be back after about 30 minutes. It's now been over 30 minutes and we're seeing an average of about 55C with a high of about 78C, so looking pretty good. Time to go ahead and swap coolers and see what another one does. I've got the Kraken x73 sitting right here. Alright, this has now been running for well over an hour and we're seeing 65 on the CPU, or if we look up at hardware monitor, see the CPU is at 65 and it got to a high of 75C, so that's not bad. Now we're going to go ahead and switch to Prime 95 and see what kind of results we get with that. Alright, this has been running for roughly 30 minutes as well, and what we're finding is 65C on the package and a max of 80C, well within specs, but still pretty hot with the max. Alright, time to change to the EK AIO and see how that does. At this point, I have now taken off the Kraken x73. I'm going to put this over to the side a little bit. And I've installed the EK AIO. And now I have gimped it a little bit because I haven't turned on the RGB fans. They're not even hooked up for it, as you can see right here. So we're going to handicap this AIO because obviously RGB helps keep it even colder. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of results we get with the EK AIO. But enough talk, let's get to the testing. So I've actually had this running for over an hour, probably closer to about 2 at this point. But if we look at the temperatures, it's averaging at about 62, 61, and at some point it hit 75C. So it's doing really well. And now it's time to see what the Prime 95 results are. So Prime 95 has now been running for over 30 minutes and we're seeing 64C on average and a max of 76C, and then, you know, it's saying 64 degrees right there, so it's doing pretty good. Alright, now it's time to take all the data that I've gathered and see what the findings were. Now that I have the numbers, here they are on the screen. And to go over them real quick, I'm just going to be going from left to right, so I'm going to start with real bench average, then high, then Prime 95 average, then high. So my EK custom loop, that's what the water block is on this anyways, averaged about 65 on real bench with a high of 76. Then the same with Prime 95, 65, then a high of 81. The EK AIO did the best with 62, 75, and then Prime 95, 64. And then the MSI Coreliquid did 66 for average, high of 76, and then Prime 95, it said an average of 55 with a high of 78. Now, I don't know what was going on with the 55. I didn't think that was wrong at the time because it was because it was the second thing I tested and didn't really have anything else to go off of at that moment. But if that upsets you, let me know in the comments below. I'll redo the test and I'll update the comments section, or I'll update the details section with the results from that. But overall, I'm really not concerned with it. But anyways, moving on. The x73 under real bench did 65 for average with a high of 75. Prime 95 average 65 with a high of 80. So my personal thoughts on these are, the very best one is going to be the custom loop. I know it didn't have the lower temperatures in all the results, but it can handle a whole lot more heat and you can upgrade it very easily. You can add in more radiators, you can add in GPUs, etc. You can cool everything with it. Whereas an AIO, unless you have a special bracket or a bracket that lets you put it onto whatever you're trying to cool, like a CPU, can't use it to cool it down, obviously. But as far as the 3 AIOs, definitely think the EK AIO is the best. Now the reason for that is when I pulled this out to be able to test it, I replaced it with the MSI Coreliquid, and between the two, this does a whole lot better job at keeping my 9800X cool. Exact same settings for how the EK was, but with the Coreliquid, it just doesn't keep it under 100C when I run real bench to test it out. Whereas when I do that with the EK AIO, it does. It actually keeps it at a somewhat reasonable temperature. It's still hot, but you know, it doesn't go above 100. But the EK does have a few downsides, and that is this tubing is really rigid. It's high quality, but I had an issue hooking it up onto my wet bench right here because of how rigid it was. Like, I had to have this turned sideways, whereas with the Coreliquid and even the NZXT, no problem. But installing it into my actual PC case, there was no issues with it. Installed perfectly. This installed exactly how I wanted it to, so everything was good that way. But the results speak for themselves. The Coreliquid, I think, looks the best out of all of them, and of the three, I think it's the coolest because it's got the pump inside the radiator, which is unique, and I personally like that. If you have an MSI motherboard, this blends in and gets controlled nicely through MSI's software with that, whereas the NZXT, you have to download its software and you have to use up one of your USB ports and whatnot. And then the EK AIO, it doesn't blend with anything. You just use your BIOS to control it, and you know, then the DRGB controller that you've got in your PC or on your motherboard or whatever else, that will control the colors for the fans on this and the pump that you can see in my other video. But let me know what you guys think of this video in the comments below. I hope you liked it, and if you did, go ahead and smash that like button. And I encourage you to smash that subscribe button so you can see my upcoming content. And thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.